I can remember the day that I first witnessed the truly immense power of nature. The real danger did not happen to me directly, but I did have a front row seat to the incredible fury of weather. What I observed on this stormy March day in 1984 was a life-threatening event that occurred to my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Whitman. Mrs. Whitman was one of the first people in my life that I remember meeting who exuded an air of positivity at seemingly all times of our many encounters. Some people seem to be naturally blessed with this gift. It was as if a skinny, 70-year-old female Buddha was living right next door to me. Perhaps I only glimpsed that side of her because she had a loving bond with the 4-year-old me. She often had a difficult time getting around, but her decreased agility never seemed to stop her from walking over to my house to have tea with my Grandma Pearl at 2 p.m. nearly every day. Both Mrs. Whitman and Grandma Pearl thoroughly enjoyed their daily tea parties. They both had a collection of Earl Greys, Chase, and Barleys. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that between the two of them they had every tea known to man. They also both had a plethora of different tea sets of various colors, shapes, and sizes. Some with pictures on them. Some with poems or funny quotes painted or etched into their metal bellies. I enjoyed the aromas when they would have their frequent afternoon tea parties. On this particular day, a tornado watch, and later warning, had been issued for a large swath of the Carolinas and Georgia. The harsh winds had caused debris to knock out the power and telephone lines. I was confused and in awe as to why the daylight was mostly blotted out by rushing clouds that I observed while peering out of our large bay window that looked out across the front yard. I had never seen it so dark outside in the middle of the day. Grandma Pearl scolded me in a nervous panic for being too close to the window. She and Mom were both uneasy by all of the commotion going on outside, but Uncle Billy did not seem to care less as he opened another Pabst Blue Ribbon. I moved to the back of the room onto the couch and watched the fury of nature from a safer distance for what seemed like hours, peering out the humongous window as if it were a big screen television that I was watching my favorite movie on. At one point, Uncle Billy cracked open the front door to smoke a cigarette, holding onto the screen door with his free hand and his foot. Uncle Billy struggled with this as the boisterous wind forced its way into the house through the small crack between the screen door and door frame that he had made. As he fought the wind's power against the screen door, he noticed something in the distance. Well, someone. When his brain caught up to the image he was seeing, he yelled for my mom and grandma to rush over to the front room where he and I were watching the angry storm. "It's Mrs. Whitman," Billy yelled, over a huge gust of wind that broke his grip from the screen door. Uncle Billy waited for Mom and Grandma to get into the front room to watch me, before he dashed out to meet Mrs. Whitman in the torrential downpour. But before he stepped out of the house, he noticed something else following the slow but determined woman inching her way toward our house. Past the road, in the distance, a massive tornado seemed to be following Mrs. Whitman. The oaks, pines, and cedar trees creaked as they waved back and forth, banging into each other. Weak branches being thrown yards away. Mrs. Whitman kept slowly advancing up the street towards us, debris flying by her, but the twister was also headed in our direction. The winds that seemingly came from every direction, and Mrs. Whitman's sheer determination, made the brave woman unaware of what was following her. But then slowly turned to look to her rear after she saw Uncle Billy dashing towards her, yelling and pointing to the oncoming force of destruction that seemed to be stalking the tiny woman. Mrs. Whitman's gait then slightly picked up in speed, but it wasn't certain that her moderately faster speed would allow for enough time to make it to my house. As the enormous whirlwind made it past the shaking trees to the street where Mrs. Whitman and now Uncle Billy were both on. She lost her grip on her umbrella, nearly knocking her over, but Uncle Billy had made the distance to her with gusto. He carefully, but quickly, scooped up Mrs. Whitman and ran back toward the house, with the elderly woman in his arms. The wind slammed the screen door back and forth just seconds after Uncle Billy and Mrs. Whitman made it safely inside our house, making it difficult to close the screen door on the way back in. Uncle Billy gave up and pushed the hardwood door closed as my mom safely guided Mrs. Whitman to the small bathroom where Grandma Pearl and I had retreated to just moments earlier. Huddled close together in the tiny bathroom, with candles flickering and 3 flashlights illuminating the room, we waited and listened to the sounds of the powerful winds grow louder. Panic seemed to be on everyone's face but mine. Even at that age, I knew how to read the room, but the tense air didn't defeat the pleasant feeling I had, being hunkered together with some of my most favorite people in the world. As fast as the bustle of the clamorous winds came, they receded. With the retreating howls of wind becoming more faint, the tension in the tightly packed room diminished as well. We slowly emerged from our hiding place to see what was left behind from the frightening cyclone of wind. Tree limbs were scattered along our street and all of the yards we could see out of the big bay window. The rain left with the twister, so Uncle Billy went outside to pick up some of the debris for later use in the fireplace. Pabst in hand. 2 yards over, a humongous old oak tree had been uprooted and lay halfway in our neighbor's yard and halfway in the street, narrowly missing power lines. It was at that point Grandma Pearl turned to Mrs. Whitman and asked,
"What exactly were you thinking walking over here during a tornado?"
"I was coming over to have some tea with you, Pearl,"
she said as a little smirk came over her face. Mom and Grandma Pearl stared blankly at her for a moment and then busted out laughing. Mrs. Whitman's smirk became a full smile that cemented in my memory of her as a woman that can smile even in the face of potential disaster. And that bravery and willpower can be accomplished by anyone.